And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Wednesday, February 18th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, for feds and retirees, uncertainty is creeping in as customer service problems and new personnel rules raise fresh questions about stability and fairness in the system. Plus, a year into the job, the VA secretary reflects on what he's learned, what he's changing, and what he hopes to tackle next. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Department of Homeland Security is in shutdown mode, but most DHS employees are continuing to work through the lapse in appropriations. In fact, many DHS personnel will also have to work without pay until the White House and lawmakers negotiate a funding deal. For more on the details, Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me now. Justin, great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
All right, people are watching this. How is the ongoing shutdown actually affecting DHS operations?
Yeah, well, it's almost like you wouldn't know there's a shutdown because about 90% of the more than 260,000 employees at DHS are going to continue showing up to work through the shutdown. That's according to DHS's shutdown plan. And so airport security screening done by the Transportation Security Administration, Secret Service and their protection mission, even FEMA and their processing or their work on ongoing disasters, while it will be impacted, it won't completely stop. And that's the case across DHS. And then, of course, there's Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Customs and Border Protection, those two agencies that are kind of at the center of this shutdown squabble between the White House and congressional Democrats. Well, they're going to continue showing up to work, and they actually have a lot of funding from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that passed last year that they can draw upon if this shutdown really drags out and they decide to prioritize certain things.
With all of the operations ongoing that you just mentioned, which DHS employees actually will be going without pay during this shutdown period?
Yeah, well, we know that there's a few broad categories. Transportation Security Administration employees, the airport screeners, they will be going without pay almost unquestionably. We saw that during the last shutdown over the fall, the 43-day shutdown, where TSA airport screeners, showed up to work, missed multiple paychecks. And in the latter portion of that shutdown, in the latter weeks, we saw an increase in call-outs and people not showing up to work because maybe they decided to go work their second job because they needed money. And that is one of the things that forced lawmakers to eventually come to the table and end that shutdown, because obviously seeing lines queue up at airport screening lanes is a bipartisan issue, to say the least. There's a lot of other employees at DHS who will go without pay if this thing stretches much longer than a week. Typically ICE, CBP, Secret Service agents, a lot of the law enforcement components would go without pay. But we saw during the last shutdown that the Trump administration prioritized those law enforcement officers for pay by moving some funding around. What they didn't do is pay the civilian side of those agencies. And so all those civilians at those agencies will go without pay during the shutdown as well.
One of the other groups that frequently rises to the top during the shutdown is the Coast Guard, as it falls under DHS. They have active duty folks and civilians. What's the story there?
Yeah, well, the Coast Guard, of course, will continue showing up to work. And during the last shutdown, as you alluded to, the active duty military service members in the Coast Guard were paid because, if you remember, the Trump administration made it a priority to pay all military service members during that shutdown. But there are, of course, thousands of Coast Guard civilians who will go without pay. And for the Coast Guard specifically, they are in the midst of a big kind of reform and modernization effort, Coast Guard Force Design 2028. So what this shutdown will affect for the Coast Guard certainly is some of those more forward-leaning efforts, some of their recruiting efforts, things like that could be tripped up if, again, this shutdown stretches on for much longer than a week.
Well, you've talked quite a bit about what will continue to happen even though it's shut down. What will stop at DHS?
Yeah, so much of DHS is operational and critical, mission critical, safety, law enforcement, things like that. And as we've talked about, those things continue. But a lot of the strategy work, a lot of the policy work that happens at DHS headquarters and at the different component headquarters, that largely ceases during the shutdown. And then you go to a place like the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. They're one of those DHS components where actually most of their staff will be, or has gone home and has essentially laid down tools, as they say in the UK. And they will no longer be able to do things like check in on federal network cybersecurity updates that they've mandated should happen across the federal government. They won't be able to work on new cybersecurity guidance that they send out to not just the federal government, but critical infrastructure partners. And so CISA is one of those agencies that's particularly hamstrung and really does shut down, except for those really critical activities during a lapse in appropriations.
Well, that might be an impetus to move the negotiations along faster if there's a cyber attack. But what are you hearing as the latest on negotiations between the congressional Democrats and the White House?
Yeah, well, over the weekend, there wasn't really any progress made, but late on Monday, Senate Democrats sent over a new counterproposal to fund DHS through September with some of the reforms that they would like to see to immigration enforcement. We don't exactly know what is in that counter proposal, but a spokesman for Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer confirmed that to CBS News and multiple media outlets. That went over late Monday. So while we wait for details on that and what the White House's response is, the House is still on recess this week, and so they will have to be quickly called back if something happens midweek or so. If not, then the earliest that they are supposed to get back is on Monday of next week. And so as we've been talking about, this seems like this is going to be at least a week-long shutdown, if not longer.
That's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks for this update.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, a year into the job, the VA Secretary reflects on what he's learned, what he's changing, and what he hopes to tackle next. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Secretary Doug Collins is a year into his tenure at the VA. He joins me now for a look back at what he learned over the past year and how those lessons informed his plan to reorganize the Veterans Health Administration. We'll also examine how VA is making progress in benefits eligibility decisions and payments. He'll lay out what's changing and why, and what he hopes to accomplish in the year ahead. Secretary Collins, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Terry, thank you for having me.
You are just wrapping up your first year. You are not new to government. You're not new to Veterans Affairs, but you were new to the VA. What most surprised you as you look back on the last 12 months?
Well, as I think the associated gray hair in my head will tell you, it was the all of a sudden seeing an agency that has such potential, great potential, that really had allowed itself to become inwardly focused instead of outwardly focused. I think that's the biggest thing that surprised me once I got here. I was used to dealing with it from the outside, but when we're actually inside, it began to over years of being badmouthed, put down, always complained about, there began to be what I would consider a cocoon effect or a shell effect where VA was only doing what they felt risk enough to do. And from day one, we said, no, we're going to put the veteran first in anything that we do, so that now anything we do is not filtered through, is this good for the department? It's going to be, is it filtered? Is it good for the veteran? And I think that's made the biggest difference. And that was one of the first things I said. Everything else we talk about today has to come off of that one premise.
Well, as we move from what you've noticed to what you're trying to fix, in December, you announced a sweeping reorganization of VA healthcare. Everything from centralizing your VISNs to standing up new health service areas. How are you ensuring that that structural change actually improves care rather than disrupts it?
Because we know right now it's not the care is suffering. We know that under the current system, and look, anybody, and I don't mean this to be critical of others. There's always a room for questions, and that's why we rolled this out in December. By the way, Terry, we started this early. We got with VSOs, we got with Congress. We've been doing one-on-ones with different members. I mean, we've been laying this out, and also tell them this is our general format. This is how we're looking to do this, and we've already had some great input. This actually changed a little bit of our direction, as you always have with a big plan. We, as of course, statutorily, if we begin to move people and we move that, then we'll have to notify Congress with a more detailed plan. Right now, we're in that early phases of making sure we have it right before this is put out and continuity of care is taken care of. But I'll also say anybody that comes out now and says, ooh, this is not something we should be doing, VA's not doing this right, I just have to remind them of 30 years of both bipartisan griping on the Hill is about the VA. And it has been from both Republicans and Democrats, chairmen and ranking members, that the governance structure has to change. All this has to change. VSOs have said it. GAO said it. OIG said it. We've just determined that we're going to be the administration that actually does it. And so we're taking in all that input. We're excited about it. Contrary to the people who don't want to see it change, if you're invested in a bad system, then you don't want to see it change because it changes what you do. Everybody that's looked at this from the VSO side and actually looked at it, our leadership in our hospitals are really excited about this. And I asked one of our career employees, I said, what do you think about this? Because I was actually really interested. And they said, sir, I don't know why we haven't done this before.
How will veterans experience a measurable change in care as you roll this out?
I think the biggest way is it's going to be transparent for the most part to the veteran itself. This is a reorganization that was really not touching the hospitals and the clinics per se, except that they're probably going to see more clinicians in there that have been in the VISN level doing administrative work. We're going to be reorganizing to put more clinicians and nurses and doctors, those kind of things, back into the hospital with more time in our clinic. So they may see newer faces. They may see, definitely we're going to look at how that would affect wait times as we go forward. But this one was one that we were not allowing our VAMC directors, the ones who run our hospitals and in turn run our clinics, make decisions. They were basically being handcuffed for years. They would ask to, do a program or to start something, and they would send it up to what became this plethora of committees up here that none talked to each other. And a year or so later, it just sort of died because nothing was happening. So we're streamlining that. So the VAMC directors and the chiefs of staff will actually be able to do their job on the front line, their tip of spear. Everybody else is just going to be support for them.
This reorganization coincides with a new community care contract structure that could possibly be $1 trillion over the next decade. How will you ensure the correct balance between veterans who get care in VA facilities and those who get care in the community?
Well, part of that is actually is the law. I mean, that's following Mission Act. And I think what we have to do is unfortunately in the previous administration, which I think which caused some chaos here, especially with community care, they had sort of done away with it to keep everything internally for various reasons. And what we're doing is a balance. If the veteran wants to get part of their care at the VA, they get direct care from us. If they want to go into the community through best medical interest or their wait times and others are outside the parameters, then they can go to the community. What this new contract is going to do, though, Terry, and I think this is really important for anybody listening, VA has been treated as a different entity. And what I mean by that for a long time is we're the largest healthcare organization in the country, but we don't act like it. And so what we have is we're measured by wait times. No other hospital or public or private, is measured on wait times. This new community care contract and our new system of scheduling is going to allow the veteran to see in real time what the potential wait time in the VA is versus a potential wait time at 3 or 4 places in the community. I think the biggest assessment is going to be the community having to explain why they're so long in many of these because they don't actually measure it. I have private health care still. I'm not in the VA system, and I don't know about you as well. But the idea of waiting, 2 weeks or even 2 or 3 months for a checkup or a physical is common practice. We do a lot of those a lot quicker in the VA. So it's going to be a lot more transparent. It's going to get people into the community where they need to and also enforce our direct care.
Your own IG and the GAO have documented quality problems with community care. Will this new contract have different kinds of metrics to ensure that the quality care provided in communities matches the VA?
Oh, very much so. In fact, that's why we're doing it. And as I shared recently with the House Veterans Affairs Committee and the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, this is a 10-year, it's still under RFP right now, so there's limited stuff I can talk about internally about this process. But when we first did this, I was on the Hill when we passed Mission Act. And I was there when we passed Choice Act. which was a complete disaster. Mission Act, though, brought it in, and we didn't have that many people wanting to help us in the third-party administrator side. We do appreciate United and Tri-West for being the partners that they've been. But we had controls built in, but VA chose not to exercise those controls many times. So if we were seeing a community care provider not providing their billing on time, or they were doing something, we were not seeing the third-party administrator actually hold them accountable. We've taken basically almost 10 years of work and put that into the RFP so that they know coming into it, we're going to hold them accountable for handling community care, them accountable for billing, them accounting for fraud, waste, and abuse, just like we do with our own self. And we're also going to have monitoring in there that we can actually, hold them accountable, the third-party administrator, if they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So we're really excited. If you look at it from a healthcare perspective, this new contract in the RFP that was led on this is putting VA at the very cutting edge of this technology.
Well, certainly healthcare is the predominance of what VA offers, but it's not the only thing. And I want to shift over to the other side of VA for a minute. Affordability is top of mind for a lot of veterans, and many of VBA's programs help address affordability on the programs that veterans rely on every day: home loans, GI Bill, other sorts of disability claims. How are you coming on the backlog and timeliness?
VBA is some of our best stories imaginable. When I got in here a year ago, we had a 260,000 plus backlog of over 125-day claims. As of yesterday, we were just under 100,000 in less than a year of actually putting that. I mean, that's taken wait times that were taking 135 days average to complete. We're down in the low 80s for average days to complete. And frankly, if I can work with our friends and our colleagues at the Department of War, we get the records and stuff transferred in a more timely fashion. We're getting down to 30 to 40 days on which we could actually have disability claims processed. That is a huge win that is helping veterans get their determinations early. The quality is excellent. And if they still want to, if they didn't think they got what they wanted, there's still the appeal process as well. So that has been great. Home loans, GI Bill stuff's being processed same day. V8 home loans, all are still going well. The Congress passed the partial claims bill. We're working on that implementation now for those who are in trouble, maybe with their mortgage. So we're doing everything in our side for educational benefits. VR&E, we just announced recently we're getting ready to hire over 300 people for our vocational rehab and education branch, which is going to cut our counselor to veteran disparity down, which means that we're, again, moving those claims quicker, getting them the vocational rehabilitation counseling in a better, more timely way. I'm very proud of our VBA folks.
You've just rattled off a number of statistics and metrics there, all of which are trending in the right direction. But there's new bipartisan legislation in the Senate that would require a national veteran strategy every 4 years that would be different from VA's strategic plan. And it has language in there that says veteran success is a national interest that goes beyond the VA. If that language were to pass, what are the key metrics that you'd want to see in that to share broadly that VA is making progress on veteran issues?
Well, I appreciate anything our congressional colleagues do to, in their role is from oversight and help going forward. If it passes in its current form or also is amended, we'll definitely do everything we possibly can to make sure that that's carried out. I think the biggest thing, though, Terry, I can tell you is this: I really want to get to the VA to where we act and are judged by our quality of care and how well we actually access patients, instead of the arbitrary numbers of wait times and other stuff that have sort of taken us off the mark of being a truly 21st century healthcare system. I think also in disability claims, the other stuff we just talked about, aligning those with making sure we're available to every veteran. We still have probably 6 to 7 million veterans in this country who access zero of their VA eligibility. And so we're reaching out. We just started a process, and I think this will be a metric that we could have, is how are we reaching out to those who are unaffected by VA right now? And I can tell you we've been sending out literally millions of emails and text messages, and we've also already enrolled almost 30,000 new veterans into the system in just the last 60 days. That's a pretty big claim. So I think aligning again, let me go back to our very first statement I told you in this interview. It's veteran first. That should be any report or any standard should be, is it veteran first? And then how does the VA carry that out?
Well, sir, we'll look forward to checking back in with you a year from now and seeing how you're doing.
Can't wait.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Take care.
That was Doug Collins, Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, when severe weather hits, alerts only save lives if people can understand them. And GAO says millions still can't. But first, for feds and retirees, uncertainty is creeping in as customer service problems and new personnel rules raise fresh questions about stability and fairness in the system. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. OPM's customer service struggles are coming at the same time the agency is rewriting policies that affect job security and appeals. We'll unpack what it all means for people counting on a stable, fair system with John Hatton, Staff Vice President for Policy and Programs at NARF. John, great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with one of our perennially favorite topics, retirement processing. What are you hearing from NARF's membership right now? How's it going?
Well, it depends. I think we're still in a waiting game for some of the information, how quickly it goes through, but we've heard some really bad stories for people who aren't even over at OPM. So they've filed for retirement at their agency, and then their claim has not yet been sent over to OPM and may be stuck at the National Finance Center. We've heard that about a large group of USA employees who were separated involuntarily, but they were eligible to retire. Then that's July 1st, and we're still hearing delays about them getting to OPM. So you can't even start that interim pay status at that point. So OPM is tracking interim pay status. So once they get the claim, it's about 7 days to at least get some portion of your annuity. Now, that's not a final adjudication of the claim. It's not the final amount you're going to get, but it's something, and they've increased the kind of percentages to try to get people closer to their full annuity. So once it gets to OPM, at least there's that interim step that I think is very critical, but we have these claims stuck at the agencies or at the payroll processor that aren't getting to OPM, which is leading to really long delays and no income for a long period of time. So that's the number one problem. The number two problem is that OPM still, once it gets that interim pay status, has a huge number of claims. I think their last inventory is 54,000 claims, when they're processing maybe about 10,000 a month. And maybe they're picking up the pace of that a little bit, but certainly not enough to get through that in a couple months, which is the normal time frame. So you have a time frame where it's supposed to be 30 to 45 days from when you apply with the agency to get over to OPM. We're looking at more than 6 months, 7 months for some people getting there. That's a huge delay. And then we're looking at the inventory and the pace of claims processing that looks like, just back of the envelope, something like 5 months when it should be closer to 60 days. So a lot of issues there. I think obviously there was a huge influx of claims in September and through the end of the year to OPM related to that deferred retirement program and a lot of these reductions in force, but clearly there's not the capacity, I think, to deal with it in a timely manner.
Are these applicants getting any sort of update or status? Do you feel like there's any systemic review going on, or is it just, hey, we'll let you know?
Yeah, so there's at least the online retirement application has provided at least a little bit of insight into kind of where it is and where it's going, more so than it has in the past. But it doesn't help if your claim is stuck at the National Finance Center and hasn't been sent over OPM and you can't get an answer from anybody. And I think that's happening for some people where they can't get an answer of why they're, what's going on with their personal claim. So it's gotten better than it used to be, but it's still far from where it should be.
Who should be pulling all of these pieces together? Is anybody looking at an end-to-end solution space for this backlog?
Well, certainly White House, OMB should be trying to get in touch with the right people at the agencies if we have an issue where they're not even getting to OPM. I think OPM is trying to do what it can do with the resources it has. But, a number of people at OPM took deferred resignation program, and they have less staff than they used to have. And so they're dealing with less people and staff to process these claims. They're trying to modernize with the digital retirement claims process. That apparently is looking like they're moving faster with those claims than the old paper-based claims, but we're still not switched over. So in some of the intermediate steps that OPM has taken to modernize, I think, are positive, but they're facing an overwhelming amount of work with an underwhelming amount of staff.
I'm speaking with John Hatton. He's Staff Vice President at the National Active and Retired Federal Employees Association. Well, John, let's keep our microscope focused on OPM for a minute longer. The schedule policy career rule became final recently. What's NARF's take on how that's going to be implemented?
Well, it doesn't go into effect for 30 days on March 9th, and we'll have to see exactly how many people are reclassified into the new schedule policy career. But OPM at the onset of the proposed rulemaking process said about 50,000 people. We do see that looks like they're going to require people to sign waivers in getting into schedule policy career to acknowledge it. For full disclosure, NARF has been challenging this policy via a lawsuit that had been on hold during the rulemaking process, but will kick back up again. So we oppose the rule on a legal basis. We're asking Congress to shore up the statutory regime to make it even more clear that it's illegal. But our main concern here is that it's taking away your rights to appeal politically based termination. And that really undermines the merit-based civil service. And instead of being able to appeal to an independent body like the Merit System Protection Board, you have to go to your general counsel, who is themselves potentially subject to the political nature of their position. So, it is a big step back for where the merit-based civil service has been, and in combination with a lot of these other policies coming out, really moves us to a more politically based civil service rather than a nonpartisan merit-based one.
Speaking of those rights to appeal, OPM's proposed some new additional regulatory changes that would centralize appeals away from MSPB, those that might deal with RIFs, probationary firings, and suitability disputes. How does this, following on the schedule policy career, increase, the risk of loss of due process, conflict of interest?
Yeah, it all taken together, it further politicizes the civil service. So if schedule policy career impacts 50,000 or more, some of these other rules are even broader in terms of their impact on the federal workforce. So suitability used to be a determination that was done as you enter civil service, but it can now be done potentially as you're no longer suitable to be working in the federal government and no longer bypassing this independent body, the MSPB appeals. We're looking at eliminating appeal rights for probationary employees, which are already limited in themselves based on politically based terminations. So this is really stepping back a lot closer to the spoils system that we had, where the people employed in the federal government had to be aligned with the political party that won the election, that maybe were campaign donors. It moves us into a situation where it's more likely to have politically based enforcement of laws, politically based provision of services favoring one group or locality over another, politically based awards of contracts or grants or exceptions to tariffs. So across the board, instead of being based on objective criteria that are laid out in law and potentially regulation, you have subjective or arbitrary criteria more based on the size of political donation or your connections.
So these changes all land at about the same time as Congress has now launched a bipartisan federal workforce caucus. I think a lot of people thought there was one already, but now there is one. So when NARF thinks about engaging with this new group, what's on your agenda to put on their agenda?
Well, this is certainly one pushing back on the politicization of the workforce. And so that is one of the things they're focusing on, is pushing back against schedule policy career. And so it's a great group of members of Congress leading the caucus. James Walkinshaw, who took over for Congressman Connolly, he used to be his chief of staff back in the day. Senator Van Hollen on the Senate side. There was a number of other senators and representatives at the launch. Steny Hoyer, a longtime supporter of federal employees, Senator Alsobrooks, Senator Kane, Suhat Subramaniam. So we're already getting a lot of people onto the caucus, and certainly I think it's a helpful way to consolidate support for these issues within a group, foster communication between these members of Congress, and help coordinate these activities in Congress. It's not as if these activities weren't already ongoing. There's already people pushing some of this legislation, but I think it will improve the coordination of it, improve the visibility of who is taking these actions in Congress for constituents, and hopefully move the ball forward on these issues.
What do you hope will be at the top of their priority list?
I think these attempts to wholesale, large-scale reductions in force outside of the approval of Congress, a politicization of the workforce in terms of the Saving the Civil Service Act and moving that forward, pushing it back against some of these other rules. So, those are the things that I believe they're working on and will continue to work on.
I've been speaking with John Hatton. He's Staff Vice President of the National Active and Retired Federal Employees Association. John, thanks as always for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, when severe weather hits, alerts only save lives if people can understand them. And GAO says millions still can't. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. GAO reports that millions of residents still receive severe weather alerts only in English, and that the National Weather Service's AI translation initiative risks stalling without better planning and stronger coordination. Technical constraints, resource shortages, and policy barriers are slowing progress nationwide. We'll look at what GAO recommends and how agencies can close trust-eroding gaps with Cardell Johnson, Director, Natural Resources and Environment at GAO. Mr. Johnson, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
This is a really important report from GAO. You note that about 26 million people in the United States have limited English proficiency, and that means they face additional risks during severe weather outbreaks because our warnings tend to be English only. As you dug into this issue, what were you really trying to understand about the federal government's current alert system?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So when doing this work, we really were trying to first just get a broad understanding of how does emergency alerts actually reach the public. And then we wanted to dive a bit deeper into that and say, okay, we understand how this gets out broadly, but what about those communities, right, who don't speak or understand much English? And so in doing the work, we really needed to understand the different emergency alerting systems. But I think it was also important in doing this work to hear from communities or groups that represent the communities about some of the sort of challenges with getting alerts and responding.
And you went to several communities. What surprised you most about their responses here?
Yeah, well, this is a topic that is definitely a public safety concern. And whenever you're talking about public safety, you really expect people to perk up and sort of really pay attention and to be very keen on it. But this is a topic here because most of the information that's coming out from the alerting system, it comes from the government. And we heard from various communities that we talk to is that sometimes folks question whether or not they can trust that information that comes from the government. And so you're hearing that, right? And you're like, oh no, because this is something that actually can save your life. So yes, you should trust it. But I think what that means, right, for the federal government, and I would say this for any level of government, is really important that we liaise with communities, that we do that outreach to sort of bridge that gap so that people do understand and trust what we're putting out so that it can save lives.
As you speak about these communities, we often think about providing the warnings in Spanish, for example, in addition to English, but there are so many other language groups that are out there. Would they find this critical information more trustworthy if it came to them in their own language?
Absolutely. That's what we heard from a lot of different organizations that represent the different groups or communities is that, if the information came to them in their native dialect, that it would be more believable and they would be willing to act.
It seems kind of like a no-brainer, but yet in your analysis, you found all kinds of reasons why that doesn't happen. Talk to us about what some of those are.
Yeah, so here you've got issues. I will sell it as three things. So there's a systems issue, there's a staffing issue, and there's a speed issue, right? So with systems, simply put, a lot of the emergency alerting systems just weren't built to support multiple languages. And, these systems are quite old. And so they need to be modernized. And on the staffing issue, a challenge with being able to provide these alerts in multiple languages is that many agencies, whether it's at the federal level or even local municipalities, which can also take steps if they need to translate alerts, they don't have the staff or maybe the budget to be able to translate quickly. And then the speed issue here, challenge, is that it's really important to do this fast and accurately because a delayed alert can be just as dangerous as getting no alert. So those are the challenges with this.
So any one of those would be a very challenging obstacle for federal bureaucracy to deal with. What happens when you put all three of them together?
Oh, it makes it extra challenging for folks to deal with and work through.
I'm speaking with Cardell Johnson. He's Director of Natural Resources and Environment at GAO. I'm suspecting that many of our localities are farther along in their modernization than the federal government. School systems have to put out notices in all kinds of different languages depending on what they deal with. But this seems like a problem that is tailor-made for an AI solution. If Google Translate can handle hundreds of different languages, why can't the National Weather Service?
Well, AI is very promising. But it does need some guardrails. And so you can't just, use AI. You've got to have a plan. You've got to have quality checks because here is, one of the things we were talking with a local emergency management agency. And one of the points that they made to us is that, hey, even in Spanish, there are variations of Spanish being spoken. And so you can have a community where, yes, they all speak Spanish, but if they are coming from, multiple different countries where there's a variation in how you might say the phrase, that could also throw people off. And so sometimes with AI, it doesn't recognize those variations. So work needs to be done to sort of train the AI models, and that really takes time. And you also need the experts who are experts in that dialect to be part of that in helping train these systems. And so the encouraging thing, though, is that the National Weather Service does have an AI translation project. And I think that the challenge that it faces there is really related to planning, but then also all of the workforce issues that are challenging much of the federal government right now.
So how is the National Weather Service doing in actually moving forward on that plan? Do they have a timeline in which they'd like to deploy this new approach?
Well, and that is what we are encouraging through our recommendation, that they need to do some additional planning, to have specific metrics to let them know they're successful. What's the timeline? Again, we're talking about emergency alerts, which are really important to make sure that we're saving lives.
As you did the report, you highlighted several friction points around this project: funding uncertainty, limits in wireless carrier capacity, broader policy headwinds around language access. How are all of these together influencing how the National Weather Service is approaching the rollout?
Yeah, so what it's meaning is that, it really has to be a well-coordinated approach. And I think one of the challenges here is that multiple agencies are involved in this. So it's not just the National Weather Service. So if I break this down, right, there's really three key agencies that are involved in this. You've got the National Weather Service. They are the weather experts. They're the ones that track storms and weather patterns. And then based on their analysis of that, they issue the official warnings like tornadoes or flash floods, and that triggers emergency alerts. But then you've got the FCC here, and think of them as the rules and the standards agency. So they have to set the requirements for how alerts must work across phones and TVs and radios. And if that wasn't enough, you've got FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, their role is like a national coordinator and operator. And what they do is they help run emergency management infrastructure so that your state, federal, tribal, local agencies can be able to send out those alerts. So that when you want to modernize a system, which also include multiple dialects to send these alerts out, that's a lot of different coordination that you have to do, and that takes time, and everyone has to be on the same page.
I really appreciate you walking us through that level of complexity, because it's one thing to say, I have Google Translate, why can't you solve this problem? And entirely another to think about deploying it through the federal bureaucracy. But nonetheless, we don't want extreme weather to be a life or death situation for most people. So within your recommendations, what does GAO suggest ought to be the priority of effort in the next year to help address this critical shortfall?
Well, this is where you've really got to lean into what we're doing with AI. You've really got to prioritize. AI has a lot of strong possibilities to help here, but you've got to prioritize the investments that go into that to be able to utilize that service. But then also, you've got to make sure that you have that funding available, because AI can't do it on its own. It has to be, you need all the different expertise, particularly folks that have expertise in the language, to make sure that it's translating correctly. So those are the things that level of planning and coordination for AI itself is very much needed.
I've been speaking with Cardell Johnson. He's Director of Natural Resources and Environment at GAO. Thank you so much for raising our awareness about this really critical infrastructure challenge. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Defense Department has locked itself into another decades-long lease, this time for privatized military barracks, expanding a housing model that has posed significant challenges for military family housing for decades. A Senate lawmaker now warns that the 50-year agreement will limit the Pentagon's ability to change contract terms and hold private companies accountable for inadequate living conditions. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis is here with more details. Anastasia, thank you for joining me.
Hi, Terry.
DOD's been talking for years about expansion of privatized barracks. Why do they want to go in that direction?
So DoD has long struggled to maintain its aging infrastructure, and it has been falling on barracks. Many are familiar with the 2023 GAO report, and that was a wake-up call both for Congress and for the Defense Department. That report detailed disastrous conditions in barracks. It detailed mold, pest infestation, broken air conditioning, broken sewage pipes, and the list goes on and on. The service's barrack system has been deeply underfunded for years, and the leadership has been openly saying that they have been prioritizing operational demands over barracks maintenance for years. In 2024, for example, Marine Corps Commandant General Eric Smith said, look, we had to focus on weapon systems. We had to focus on technology for the past 2 decades of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I can't apologize for prioritizing training and equipment. But now we have to focus on that. So the services now continue to face this growing backlog of necessary repairs, and privatized barracks would help address some of this massive, long-standing backlog of deferred maintenance. It would help modernize barracks, and it would help DoD focus on its mission.
There was a pretty high-profile incident last summer with Marine Corps barracks, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And not just the Marine Corps. I think just a couple of months ago, it was a very high-profile case with the Navy. There are just so many cases like that.
It goes across all of the services.
Absolutely.
Well, the services have been struggling with privatized military housing for similar decades. What's driving the scrutiny there, and why do they think it will be better applied to military barracks?
Yeah, many are familiar that private companies now have control over 99% of military housing in the U.S., and they have this lucrative long-term contracts. And it has become a crisis. A new survey, for example, has found that nearly every service member living in a privatized home has experienced serious problems. Many report their family's health had been negatively affected by their housing conditions. Military families say work orders are often ignored. Many families pay a lot of out-of-pocket expenses for things like air purifiers or hotel stays just to manage these inhabitable conditions. It's almost impossible to hold the companies accountable. The companies have a practice of making military families sign non-disclosure agreements, and that would prohibit families from talking about conditions that they had in their military homes once they move out. Just one example, just recently, military families who lived at an Air Force base in Tampa, Florida, filed a lawsuit against the private company called the Michaels Organization over hazardous living conditions, particularly over toxic mold and persistent water damage that wouldn't be fixed. And in that lawsuit, military families alleged that their pleas for help would be met with corporate indifference, and they alleged that the company has a cartel-like hold on the housing monopoly. That company has also been accused of requiring military families to sign those non-disclosure agreements. And a side note, their chief executive in 2024 was named in a federal racketeering indictment, but then the charges were dropped. But this is an example, and this lawsuit is just one of dozens of lawsuits filed over the last couple of years.
Members of Congress are weighing in here as well. What are they saying about the effort to privatize barracks?
Yeah, so last year, Senator Elizabeth Warren asked the Pentagon about their plan to privatize barracks. That would be starting with the one at Fort Irwin in California. Their recent responses show that they have locked in a lease running through 2079 with the Michaels Organization that we just talked about. She asked questions like what penalties would be put in place should the Michaels Organization violate the terms of the agreement. And the department didn't really mention any specific accountability tools or measures, just beyond withholding award incentives when providers fail to meet their agreement requirements. She also asked to what extent the current contracts between DoD and private companies give DoD the ability to amend agreement terms, to which DoD said that the project ground leases are real estate partnership agreements and that do not include or require explicit change clauses for the benefit of the government. So Warren said that this would just limit the department's ability to fight back against private companies if anything goes wrong. And, there is a proven record for DoD of 50-year leases with no change clauses, kind of silencing families with NDAs in companies being shielded from FOIAs. So it's possible the model could work, but there has to be some basic accountability for private companies.
It sounds like DoD is moving forward. Are they expanding the barracks privatization beyond Fort Irwin?
So far, they have a couple of projects. For the one in California that we just talked about, they're saying that the Army will actually not be assigning soldiers to units within that development, and they will not guarantee occupancy for this project. There are also projects for junior enlisted troops at Fort Meade in Maryland and at Army Garrison Miami, and it supports Southern Command. The department said that the Army is looking at the expansion of privatized barracks, but it's under no obligation or kind of commitment to do so. They also said that currently they do not have any proposals from the military departments to expand the unaccompanied housing privatization beyond the projects that they already have.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Anastasia, thanks for keeping us updated on this important issue.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editors are Daisy Thornton and Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.